We've been studying through Joshua, for those of you who are visiting with us. And as we do that, I've come across several passages that I'd never thought to preach from before. And this morning's is one of those. It's in Joshua 20, where they establish the cities of refuge. You know, we've all played games, I think, when we're kids, where you have the concept of a safe place, like a home base. And maybe maybe you're playing tag, or maybe you're playing capture the flag, or you're playing one of those games, or even baseball has this built into it, that if you make it to the base, once you can get there, then you're safe. Nothing bad can happen to you as long as you stay on the base, right? But we all know that kind of as you venture off, as soon as you step off of it, you're in danger a little bit. You could be picked off or called out, or have, you could be, out, and that your turn is over. So it's a lot of fun. And it's exhilarating once you leave that base and you see the other one. You've got to make it if you can just make it to the base, then you'll be safe. Or if you're playing in the yard with your friends and they're chasing you, or they're after you, if you can just make it to this place, then you're going to be safe. And that's exactly what the cities of refuge were, only in a much more serious way, in a life and death kind of way. And I don't really know where this concept in our childhood comes from, of having a base that you can make it to and be safe there. But it is interesting that this concept is definitely here in the cities of refuge in the Old Testament. And so we're going to be looking at those this morning, and some interesting applications that we can consider. Maybe you can go ahead and let your mind be wondering, how could we see this in ourselves? How can we see this in Jesus? So in this part of Joshua, we're in this kind of second half where the major battles are over and they're dividing up the land among the tribes. As we saw last week, Manasseh and Ephraim were not happy with their allotment and they complained about it. That was the lesson from last week. And this week we come to the inheritance of the Levites. Now you might remember back in chapter 13 that they were told that the Levites would not be given a portion of land. Their inheritance was to serve in the temple or serve in the tabernacle. So they were not given any chunk of territory like you see all the other tribes have. The Levites did not get that, but they did get cities. In fact, they were given 48 cities, and 6 of these were designated as cities of refuge. So in Joshua chapter 20, verse 1, it says, "Then the Lord said to Joshua, say to the people of Israel, appoint the cities of refuge of which I spoke to you through Moses, that the manslayer who strikes any person without intent or unknowingly may flee there. There shall be for you a refuge from the avenger of blood." And it goes on to describe that a little more in detail. And at the end, down in verses 7 through 9, we see where these cities actually were. I've roughly marked them on the map here so you kind of get an idea. But they were strategically chosen to be spread out through the territories. And as I understand it, the idea was that you could make it to one of those in a day. That's what I read anyway. And so wherever you happen to be, if you needed to get to a safe place, you could flee and you could run and you could make it to one. So they had them spaced out around their territory so people could find one of those. Now, there's some instructions here in Joshua 20 about it, but you notice that he says, as Moses wrote. And there's actually more information in the law of Moses. So we're going to leave this and go over to Numbers chapter 35, because there's more details there about these cities of refuge. So let's go to Numbers chapter 35. It's basically summarized for us there in Joshua, but we'll look at some of these particulars. So skipping down into the middle of this to kind of lay this principle, the reason why these needed to exist is because of the consequence of killing somebody. The law of Moses, in addition to being their religious law that taught them how to worship God and the sacrifices and all that, was also their civil law. So it had to deal with all kinds of things, like what happens if you steal something. What's somebody going to do if you injure your neighbor's animal? Or there's all those kinds of things, property and all those things had to be included in the law, including the worst offense, which is what happens if a person kills another person. And in general, we find out in Numbers 35, verse 30, if anyone kills a person, the murderer shall be put to death on the evidence of witnesses. No person shall be put to death on the testimony of one, Moreover, you shall accept no ransom for the life of a murderer who is guilty of death, but he shall be put to death. So if it could be established with 2 witnesses at least that this person killed that person, then the law was he was to be put to death. No amount of money can be his life can't be spared because his family comes up with a big sum. Nothing like that. He's guilty of murder. He's to be put to death. Pretty clear, right? And as we'll see, what's embedded in this, and I couldn't find it spelled out specifically anywhere, but it's pretty clear as you read the various passages that the primary responsibility for carrying out this killing the murderer fell on someone called the Avenger of Blood, who was a close family member. So in other words, if somebody killed my brother and I found out about it, then I'm now responsible for finding the murderer and killing the murderer. And I would be the Avenger of Blood. And you can find a few examples of that throughout the scripture. So that's an interesting twist in this whole thing. But what happens, and the purpose for these cities is not to spare the murderer from his punishment. But the purpose of these cities is, what if somebody killed somebody accidentally or without intent? And how are we going to handle that? Because now the Avenger is going to find out, you killed my brother, he's going to be trying to kill you, but what if it wasn't intentional? And now you could see how that could almost set in motion kind of one of these Hatfield and McCoy kind of problems where, now I'm going to kill you. And it kind of could, create a huge issue if it was an accident or unintentional. And so this was the law's way of handling that. You might wonder, what kind of accidental death are we talking about? Well, there's another passage that includes this as well, and it's in Deuteronomy 19, and it gives this example. This is the provision for the manslayer. That's what it's said of murderer, the manslayer, who by fleeing there, talking about the cities of refuge, may save his life. If anyone kills his neighbor unintentionally, without having hated him, so notice that, they get to the heart of, is there motive, right? Some hatred, no hatred. As, for example, verse 5, when someone goes into the forest with his neighbor to cut wood, and his hand swings the axe to cut down a tree, and the head slips from the handle, and he strikes his neighbor so that he dies, that's an example. Then he may flee to one of these cities and live, lest the Avenger of Blood, in hot anger, pursue the manslayer and overtake him, because the way is long. What it's saying is these need to be spaced around where you could get to him. And strike him fatally, though he did not deserve to die, since he had not hated his neighbor in the past. So you start to get a little insight into the principles that are embedded in the law here about how to handle these kind of situations. One of them is, these 2 guys go out there working in the woods, and one of them's dead now. Well, did it come to light that this other guy had it out for him? He'd hated him all along, and he had made that known somehow, and he had, then that would kind of factor into whether this was accidental or not. But if they were buddies and they worked together and and it was just an accident, then that's different. And so the law had these provisions, and one of them was this cities of refuge. And so from what I understand is, after this, let's say these 2 guys are out working in the woods, and now his buddy's dead, and that guy's closest relative, whoever the Avenger of Blood is going to find out, and then he's going to feel like, I've got to now go take vengeance. But this guy can run for his life to a city of refuge. What would happen when he got there? He would explain to the elders of the city the situation. And he could stay there until a trial could happen. He would stay there until there was a hearing. And then the people would decide, is he truly innocent, or does he, was he a murderer or was he not? So let's go, if you're still there in Numbers 35, we'll read a little bit more details about this. Verse 9, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the people of Israel and say to them, when you cross the Jordan into the land of Canaan, then you shall select cities to be cities of refuge for you, that the manslayer who kills any person without intent may flee there. The city shall be for you a refuge from the avenger, that the manslayer may not die until he stands before the congregation for judgment. So here's some more examples of what would constitute to help them decide. So let's say there's going to be a trial, there's going to be a hearing. You're going to have this guy, he killed this guy. There's no question about that. We know he did it, but is he a murderer or was it accidental? So there's some principles here that the congregation was to use in deciding that. Verse 4, this is the provision for the manslayer who by fleeing there may save his life. If anyone kills his neighbor unintentionally without having hated him in the past, oh, sorry, I was in Deuteronomy 19. Numbers 35, verse 16. But if he struck him down with an iron object so that he died, he's a murderer. All right, so you cannot use a weapon, right, and claim that it was an accident. And if he struck him with a stone tool that could cause death, and he died, then he is a murderer. The murderer shall be put to death. If he struck him down with a wooden tool and he died, he's a murderer. The avenger of blood, verse 19, shall put the murderer to death. If when he meets him, he shall put him to death. And if he pushed him out of hatred or hurled something at him, lying in wait so that he died, in enmity struck him down with his hand so that he died, he who struck the blow shall be put to death. He's a murderer. The avenger of blood shall put the murderer to death when he meets him. So now there's this avenger. He's got this job to do. Whenever he crosses paths with that guy, he used to take him out because he's a murderer. But he gives this clarification in verse 22. If he pushed him suddenly without enmity, there's no motive, or if you hurled something on him without lying in wait, he didn't plan it, it wasn't premeditated, or if he used a stone that could cause death, but without seeing him dropped it on him, so it was an accident, so he died, and he was not his enemy, did not seek his harm, then the congregation shall judge between the manslayer and the avenger of blood in accordance with these rules. Very, very interesting. And I'm not obviously not trained in the law, but I would imagine that some of these same principles are built into our law when determining, whether somebody is guilty of murder or whether it was an accident. Some of the same things. Well, was it planned? Did you hate this person? Should you have known a stone that could cause death? Can you claim? Anyway, all these things are built into the law to give the people, the congregation, some rules to use in these circumstances. And meanwhile, the guy can wait and hang out safely in the city of refuge until there can be a hearing. So what happens if they decide, they listen to the evidence, the witnesses come forward and they say, yeah, this was clearly an accident. He was working in the woods. Those guys were friends. It was an accident. There was no planning. There was no forethought. There was no intention. Now, can everybody just go about their business? Not quite. In fact, he could stay there and live in the city of refuge safely. And he had to stay there until the death of the high priest. This was just the rule. So he had to stay in the city of refuge. Even though he's been found not guilty, he's still a manslayer. So there is a consequence. And the consequence is you now can live safely in this city, that's like your home base, until the high priest dies. And at that time, you can go on about your business. But notice this clarification in verse 26 of Numbers 35. If the manslayer shall at any time go beyond the boundaries of his city of refuge to which he fled, then the avenger of blood finds him outside the boundaries of his city of refuge, and the avenger of blood kills the manslayer, he shall not be guilty of blood. For he must remain in his city of refuge until the death of the high priest. After the death of the high priest, the manslayer may return to the land of his possession. So, very interesting. You kill somebody, even though it's accidental. You run there, you can make it there safely. Now there's going to be a hearing. The people come, the avenger of blood comes, the witnesses come, the congregation hears you out. They decide, no, this was an accident. Or they decide, no, you're guilty. In that case, you'd be put to death. But if they decide it was an accident, it was no intent, then you can stay there, and you have to live there till the high priest dies. Now, if you get tired of living there, or you think, well, maybe everybody's forgot about it. It's been a year, whatever, and you venture out, you go back home because you'd rather be, in your place. Well, when that avenger of blood crosses paths with you, if he decides to take vengeance, no blood on his hands. There's nothing bad will happen to him because you ventured out. So you have to stay in this city of refuge until the high priest dies. So it's kind of interesting. Again, it reminded me of the idea of just having like a safe base. And as long as you're there on that base, nothing bad can happen. But as soon as you step off of it, then you're in danger. So you might think, well, that's kind of neat. I mean, obviously, we're not under the same laws. Even in the New Testament, we talk about vengeance. We see vengeance is mine, says the Lord. It's not our job. We don't have the avenger role in the New Testament. We don't. None of us are charged with making sure we make somebody pay when they do wrong. In fact, we follow Jesus' example of just trusting God with all of that. And because our law is not civil law, not a criminal law. The law that we live under is not one that's meant for a society to enforce these kind of rules, but instead it's a spiritual thing to how we live here in this world. And so we leave all that punishment and avenging up to God. So that part of it doesn't really apply to us. But I think we can see some interesting parallels about this in a broader sense, even in the Old Testament. For example, over and over and over, God himself is referred to as a refuge. Lots of Psalms use this, and some of them sound a lot like this picture of the cities of refuge. For example, notice what David says in Psalm 7. He says, "O Lord, my God, in you do I take refuge. Save me from all my pursuers and deliver me, lest like a lion they tear my soul apart." You might start thinking about some New Testament principles here as we think about that. "Rending it in pieces with none to deliver. O Lord, my God, if I have done this, if there's wrong in my hands, if I've repaid my friend with evil or plundered my enemy without cause, let the enemy pursue my soul and overtake it. Let him trample my life to the ground and lay my glory in the dust. Selah. Arise, O Lord, in your anger. Lift up yourself against the fury of my enemies. Awake for me. You have appointed a judgment. Let the assembly of the peoples be gathered about you. Over it return on high." Now, this sounds like David is describing himself being in a circumstance where there's somebody in hot pursuit. There's people chasing him, seeking his life. He's making it as fast as he can to the Lord, and he's saying to the Lord, "You are my refuge," not to one of these cities, but this is all talking about in faith. He's trusting God. He's coming to God and saying, "I'm trusting myself to you to separate me from these guys who are having it out for me, even though I haven't done them wrong." He says, "If I'm guilty of something, then I'll take what's coming." But he feels like they're chasing him for no reason. They're out for him. They're enemies of his, even though he's done them no harm. And so he's leaving it to God, and he's trusting God, and he's saying, "Awake, kind of protect me, and until there can be some judgment," which is what would happen in the case of the, one of these things. There'd be the assembly would gather, and they would hear it out. And he's basically saying to God, "If the assembly be gathered, you be the judge, you decide between me and my enemies and protect me. But I'm putting myself in your care." That was David's sort of attitude toward God. There's a couple of others that fit this kind of mold, I believe. In Psalm 5, it says, "Let all who take refuge in you rejoice. Let them ever sing for joy and spread your protection over them, that those who love your name may exult in you. For you bless the righteous, O Lord. You cover him with favor as with a shield." Many, many times when we read these verses that talk about God as a refuge, it compares God to a fortress or a shield. And so you start to get the idea that seeking refuge in God is the idea going into a safe place like a fortress, where as soon as you make it in there and they close the doors, you're in there with him, or God taking a shield and he's basically standing and blocking and protecting you. And so imagine one of those people who had accidentally killed somebody, and you finally get to this city, and now it's this whole city, they know this. It's been designated by the law. You guys have this, you're a refuge, you're a safe place. And when this guy comes there, you protect him. When the avenger of blood shows up and he's "Give me him, I'm going to kill him," the whole city would be a protection against that vengeance. And so in the same way, this is talking about God being a refuge where we can flee to him and he becomes our protection, our shield. And there's many other verses, just one more from Nahum. "The Lord is good, a stronghold in the day of trouble. He knows those who take refuge in him." So this is obviously this idea of taking refuge is a little broader than just specifically this, but I just thought those are interesting to compare this to those cities of refuge. Now, some other verses warn the people of Israel about taking refuge in other things. Like, for example, it's better to take refuge in the Lord than to trust in man. It's better to take refuge in the Lord than to trust in princes. So it's like, who are you going to trust to protect you and care for you? It should be the Lord. And in Isaiah, he's angry with them because they're plotting to go take refuge in Egypt. And he says, "You shouldn't be doing that." He says, "Stubborn children, declares the Lord, who carry out a plan, but not mine, who make an alliance, but not of my spirit, that they may add sin to sin, who set out to go down to Egypt without asking for my direction, to take refuge in the protection of Pharaoh, and to seek shelter in the shadow of Egypt. Therefore shall the protection of Pharaoh turn to your shame, the shelter in the shadow of Egypt to your humiliation. God wanted his people to take refuge in him, to trust in him. And he got angry when they would say, uh-oh, we're in danger. We need to go down here to Egypt and let Pharaoh care for us and protect us and shield us. And we'll run down there, and that'll be our place of refuge, will be Egypt. That angered God because he had told them, don't do that. Now, those are some kind of Old Testament passages that expand this idea. But I want to look at one. Have you thought of a place in the New Testament that says fleeing for refuge? There's a verse in the New Testament, and it's in Hebrews chapter 6. It's the one place I could find that seems to have this same image in mind. In Hebrews chapter 6, and it's in verses 17 through 20. This is the passage about having an anchor of the soul and a hope. But notice, and I never really thought about it until I was thinking about these people running to the city of refuge. This phrase kind of jumped out at me. Verse 17, so when God desired to show more convincingly to the heirs of the promise the unchangeable character of his purpose, he guaranteed it with an oath. So that by two unchangeable things in which it's impossible for God to lie, we who have fled for refuge might have strong encouragement to hold fast to the hope that's set before us. We have this as a sure, steadfast anchor of the soul, a hope that enters into the inner place behind the curtain where Jesus has gone as a forerunner, having become a high priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. So we, as Christians, can think of ourselves as having fled for refuge to God. We have run for our lives to make it to God, and we take shelter in him, and we are safe in him, and we seek refuge in him from what? Well, let's consider that. Who would be out there to get us? Why are we having to run to God for refuge? Well, for one, there is the enemy. There is the thief. Jesus says in John 10:10, he comes to steal and kill and destroy. He's out there. And remember in that passage, Jesus is talking about a flock and a gate. And if they're his sheep and they're here with him, the shepherd's going to protect them from the enemy who comes to steal and kill and destroy. He's out there, and he's looking to get us. He's like a roaring lion seeking someone to devour. We need safety. We need shelter. We need protection. Where do we find it? We find it in God. And so we flee to him. And perhaps we could even see in the similarity to these cities of refuge that the whole thing that set that in motion was some action that you had done. Where, this person did something, and now because of their consequence of their action, their only hope of living is to run for refuge. In our case, we would see that being basically sin. When we've done things we shouldn't do, we're now condemned, and we stand condemned. In fact, let's go to Revelation chapter 12. There is this accuser. That's Satan's role, in a way, to be the accuser. And he has these, he's accusing us and wanting us to be condemned and punished. And he's seeking us to devour us and destroy us. Perhaps like this avenger of blood who's out there on the hunt for you, and you've got to make it to this city of refuge. And if you can just get there, you'll be safe from the avenger. Revelation 12 talks about this battle in heaven, and it says in verse 9, the great dragon was thrown down, the ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. And I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, now the salvation and power and kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have come, for the accuser of our brothers has been thrown down, who accuses them day and night before our God. So remember, in the setup to this whole thing, the avenger of blood, in pursuit of his prey, is chasing him, hoping he can kill him. The guy is on his run for his life, has to make it to one of those cities. Now, when he gets there, on his heels comes the avenger of blood. And the city says, whoa, 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 right? And protects him from this guy who said, but he did this, he did that. And in a way, that's sort of, I think, what Satan is doing, constantly accusing, pointing out, wanting us to be lost, wanting us to be condemned. We seek shelter in God, and we find there that we have protection from the accuser who is trying to destroy us, who's trying to seek us out. And we do that not because we're innocent, by the way. We do that because of the blood of the Lamb. Verse 11 in the same chapter says, and they have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb. It's not because we can make an argument and prove that we're innocent. In our case, we actually are guilty, but it's because Jesus died for us, and he died for us to save us from this guilt. Now, turn back to Revelation 5, and notice what it says there. Revelation 5, beginning in verse 8, this is praising the Lamb who was slain. Remember, nobody could be found that could open the scroll, but then a lamb who had been slain kind of steps into the scene. In verse 8, when he had taken the scroll, the 4 living creatures, the 24 elders, fell down before the Lamb, each holding a harp and golden bowls full of incense, which are the prayers of the saints. And they sang a new song, saying, worthy are you to take the scroll and open its seals, for you were slain, and by your blood you ransomed people for God from every tribe and language and people and nation. And you made them a kingdom and priests to our God, and they shall reign on the earth. Do you remember what was said in the law about someone guilty of murder and ransom? It said they shall not be ransomed, right? So if you did this, no amount of money could be piled up to go and pay and get you to escape the consequence of your actions. But because Jesus died for us, his blood, worth more than any riches on earth, is the ransom that protects us from the consequences of our own actions. We can seek shelter in him, and he did ransom us, and so that we don't have to be put to death by the avenger who is out to get us. And so what must we do then? Well, pretty clearly, once we recognize the situation that we're in and we realize our predicament, imagine that guy, and you're doing something, you're working together, you're building and construction, you're whatever you're doing. And through some action of yours, somebody is now dead. Pretty quickly, you'd have to do the math, right? You'd have to be thinking, how far is that city? And how can I get there? I read a note about those cities, and it said that the roads leading to them were marked by signposts at the crossroads with the inscription Miklat, or refuge. And the roads were broad and smooth and level in order that the fugitive might not be hindered. So when I was growing up in Limestone County, I thought everywhere in the world had this, but they don't. I didn't know it until I left Limestone County. But at various places in Limestone County, there's this thing that says nuclear evacuation route. I didn't know that the whole country didn't have those signs, but it's really only around Browns Ferry nuclear plant. But if you drive around out in the country, you come to a crossroads and it says, and I always figured, I don't know how fast you could drive away from a nuclear explosion anyway. It doesn't seem like, that if you're trying to rely on those signs to escape some meltdown, you're probably in trouble. But anyway, the sign would say, this way, if you're getting away. Well, apparently in Israel and around there, the roads that led to these cities would be marked with a sign saying, this is the way. And so if you knew that somebody's about to kill you if they can catch you, and you're running for your life to make it, and you see that city and you just got to get to it and you'll be safe. That's the same motivation we should have when we recognize our circumstance, that we're guilty of sin, that Satan's out to destroy us, and our hope and our safety is in making it to the Lord and seeking refuge in him. We should flee to him for refuge. That's exactly the kind of things that David would say that he did. And then remember, and I think it's an interesting little twist, and perhaps it's there for us to learn, as we know the law was given for us to learn from it. Why do you suppose there was this little provision that you have to stay in the city of refuge once you'd been decided you were innocent until the priest died? Interesting, isn't it? But for us who have sought refuge in God, when we are in the Lord, when we're in his, when part of his sheep in his flock that he's protecting, we're safe from the thief who came to steal and kill and destroy. But if we venture out and we leave him, we leave the city, we leave his protection, we're in big danger. It's like when you lead off a little too far from the base, you're in danger, right? Somebody's gonna get you. You're not safe anymore. And so as Christians, if we remain in fellowship with him, in his care, in his kingdom, if in his protection, then there's nothing out there that can harm us. There's no force of evil, there's no enemy that can threaten us, because God is our shield and our fortress. But if we choose to venture out and we choose to wander away, then we're in danger because there's a lion out there seeking to destroy us. So I thought all those were some interesting parallels that we can consider. Hebrews 12 says, we have come to Mount Zion, to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, to innumerable angels in festal gathering, to the assembly of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven, to God, the judge of all, the spirits of the righteous made perfect, to Jesus, the mediator of the new covenant, the sprinkled blood that speaks a better word, the blood of Abel. I included that because it says that we've come to this city. So like you arrive at that city of refuge. The city of refuge that we have is the heavenly Jerusalem. And we arrive there and we are safe there. And that's where we should all try to be and to remain until the time is over and the Avenger is done away with forever and we don't have to worry about that anymore. Perhaps there's someone this morning who needs to flee to the Lord, or maybe you've wandered away from the city and you've been in danger and you want to come back. If there's any way that we can help, please